The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton's training grounds as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez wiped sweat from his brow. The Marine had seen his share of tough guys during his 12 years of service, but today felt different. Word had spread through the base like wildfire that morning. A Navy SEAL was coming to observe their hand-to-hand combat training session. Rodriguez adjusted his stance as he watched his fellow Marines gather around the training mat. These weren't fresh recruits. They were seasoned fighters who had earned their stripes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Each man carried himself with the confidence that came from surviving real combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. "Marines, listen up," barked Gunnery Sergeant Thompson, his voice cutting through the desert air like a blade. "We've got a visitor today. Petty Officer Jake Morrison from SEAL Team 5 will be observing our training protocols." Thompson's eyes swept across the assembled group. "I expect you to show him what Marine Corps fighting spirit looks like." The Marines exchanged glances, some grinning with anticipation. They had heard stories about Navy SEALs, but Marines prided themselves on being the toughest ground fighters in the military. This was their chance to prove that reputation wasn't just talk. Morrison appeared at the edge of the training area, walking with the measured pace of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He stood about 6 feet tall, with the lean build of a distance runner rather than the bulky frame most people associated with elite warriors. His clean-shaven face showed no emotion as he surveyed the group, and his dark eyes seemed to take in every detail without revealing any thoughts. "Doesn't look like much," whispered Corporal Davis to Rodriguez. "I expected someone more intimidating." Rodriguez nodded, but something in Morrison's calm demeanor made him pause. In his experience, the most dangerous fighters weren't always the ones who looked the part. Still, the SEAL appeared almost ordinary compared to the battle-hardened Marines surrounding him. Thompson called the group to attention. "Today we're focusing on close-quarters combat scenarios. Rodriguez, you're up first. Show our guest how Marines handle business." Rodriguez stepped onto the mat, facing off against Corporal Jenkins, a stocky fighter known for his aggressive style. The two men circled each other, looking for openings. Rodriguez had trained extensively in the Marine Corps martial arts program, combining techniques from boxing, wrestling, and judo. He felt confident in his abilities. The sparring session began with both Marines testing each other's defenses. Rodriguez threw a quick jab, which Jenkins deflected before countering with a hook that Rodriguez ducked. They grappled briefly, each trying to gain position for a takedown. The match continued for several minutes, with neither fighter gaining a decisive advantage. Morrison watched silently from the sideline, his expression unchanged. Occasionally, he would nod slightly or tilt his head, as if analyzing something the others couldn't see. His quiet observation began to draw curious glances from the Marines who weren't currently fighting. "Your turn, Morrison," Thompson announced after Rodriguez and Jenkins finished their match. "Care to show us how the Navy does it?" A subtle smile crossed Morrison's face for the first time since his arrival. "I appreciate the invitation, Gunny, but I'd prefer to just observe today, if that's all right." Some of the Marines chuckled. Corporal Williams, a heavyweight with hands like sledgehammers, stepped forward. "Come on, SEAL. We don't bite. Unless you're not comfortable with Marine-style training." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison's calm exterior didn't change, but Rodriguez noticed his shoulders relax slightly. It was a subtle shift, but it reminded Rodriguez of a cat preparing to pounce. "I wouldn't want to interfere with your training schedule," Morrison replied diplomatically. "Nonsense," Thompson interjected. "We've got time for one more match. Williams here is one of our best. It will be good for both services to see how our techniques compare." Morrison looked around the circle of expectant faces. These Marines had been nothing but professional, but he could sense the underlying challenge in their invitation. They wanted to test him to see if the Navy's elite lived up to their reputation. "All right," Morrison said finally, removing his watch and setting it aside. "But let's keep it friendly." Williams grinned and stepped onto the mat, rolling his shoulders to loosen up. At 6'3" and 240 pounds, he had a significant size advantage over the SEAL. His reach was longer, and his wrestling background had served him well in countless training matches. As the two men faced each other, Rodriguez noticed something different about Morrison's posture. The casual, relaxed bearing he had maintained while watching was replaced by something more focused. His feet were positioned in a way Rodriguez didn't immediately recognize, not the typical fighting stance taught in Marine training. Standard rules, Thompson announced. No strikes to the face, no joint locks. Match ends with submission or when I call it. Williams immediately pressed forward, using his size advantage to try and close distance. He threw a body shot that Morrison avoided with minimal movement, sliding just outside the range of the punch. Williams followed up with another combination, but Morrison seemed to anticipate each strike, moving with an efficiency that made his evasions look effortless. The watching Marines began to take notice. Morrison wasn't just dodging punches. He was reading Williams like an open book. Every feint, every setup, every attempt to create an opening was countered before it could develop. He's quick, Rodriguez muttered to Davis. Williams, growing frustrated, attempted a takedown. As he lunged forward, Morrison's response was unlike anything the Marines had seen in their training. Instead of sprawling back or trying to overpower Williams, Morrison stepped to the side at the last possible moment, his hands moving in a fluid motion that redirected Williams' momentum. The big Marine found himself stumbling past his target, off balance and vulnerable. Morrison could have easily capitalized on the opening, but instead he simply stepped back and reset his position. Lucky break, Williams said, breathing harder than he expected. He had been confident that his wrestling skills would give him an edge in close combat. Morrison said nothing, but his stance shifted again. Rodriguez, who had been studying martial arts since his teenage years, finally recognized the positioning. It wasn't military combat training. It was karate, but refined to a level he had never seen before. Williams attacked again, this time with more caution. He jabbed, testing Morrison's reactions, then followed with a cross. Morrison's response was immediate and precise. His left hand intercepted the jab with a deflection that sent Williams' punch harmlessly aside, while his right hand moved in a circular motion that trapped Williams' follow-up strike. For a split second, Williams was completely open, his balance compromised by Morrison's redirection. The SEAL could have ended the match instantly with a counterstrike, but instead he simply held the position for a moment before releasing Williams and stepping back. The message was clear without words. I could have finished this whenever I wanted. Williams' confidence began to waver. He was a skilled fighter who had dominated most training matches, but Morrison was operating on a different level entirely. Every attack was being neutralized not through superior strength or speed, but through technique that seemed to turn Williams' own force against him. Thompson watched with growing interest. He had overseen thousands of training matches, but Morrison's style was unlike anything in a Marine Corps curriculum. The SEAL wasn't just defending. He was controlling the entire flow of the match without appearing to exert any effort. What kind of training do SEALs get? Davis whispered to Rodriguez. Rodriguez shook his head, unable to answer. He was beginning to suspect that Morrison's abilities had little to do with his Navy training and everything to do with something else entirely. Williams made one more serious attempt, feinting low before shooting for a double-leg takedown. It was a move that had worked countless times against other opponents, but Morrison's counter was devastating in its simplicity. As Williams committed to the takedown, Morrison's knee came up in a checking motion that completely disrupted Williams' approach. At the same time, Morrison's hands found their way to Williams' shoulders, and suddenly, the big Marine was airborne. It wasn't a violent throw, but a controlled movement that sent Williams tumbling across the mat in a way that left him completely helpless. Williams landed hard, but safely, the wind knocked out of him more from surprise than impact. As he looked up at Morrison, who stood calmly in the center of the mat, he realized that nothing he had thrown at the SEAL had even come close to succeeding. The training area fell silent. Every Marine present understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't the result of superior military training. This was artistry in motion. Morrison extended a hand to help Williams to his feet. "Good match," he said simply, as if nothing unusual had happened. But Rodriguez could see it in Morrison's eyes now, a depth of knowledge and experience that went far beyond anything they taught in military combat programs. The quiet SEAL had been holding back significantly, and even then, he had made one of their best fighters look like a beginner. As Williams caught his breath, trying to process what had just happened, Rodriguez found himself wondering what other surprises Morrison might be hiding. The afternoon was far from over, and something told him they were about to learn a lot more about their unassuming visitor. The questions were about to begin, and Morrison's answers would change everything these Marines thought they knew about fighting. The silence that followed Williams' takedown stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every Marine on the training ground found himself reassessing what he had just witnessed. Williams sat on the mat, still processing how easily Morrison had controlled their entire exchange. "That was impressive technique," Thompson said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "Mind sharing where you picked that up?" Morrison helped Williams to his feet, his demeanor remaining humble despite what had just occurred. "I've studied karate for most of my life, Gunny. Started when I was 8 years old. Karate." Corporal Davis stepped forward, his tone carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "I thought that was more about forms and breaking boards. What we just saw looked like serious combat technique." Morrison's slight smile returned. "There are many different styles of karate and many different ways to approach training. What most people see in movies or demonstrations is just the surface level." Rodriguez found himself genuinely intrigued. His own martial arts background included some karate training, but nothing he had learned prepared him for what Morrison had just demonstrated. "What style do you practice?" "I started with Shotokan when I was young," Morrison replied, "but over the years I've trained in several different systems. Kyokushin, Goju-Ryu, some Okinawan styles that most people haven't heard of. Each one taught me something different about timing, distance, and body mechanics." Williams, who had regained his composure, looked at Morrison with new understanding. "How long have you been training?" "About 24 years now," Morrison answered, "though I'm still learning something new every day." The number hit the Marines like a physical blow. 24 years of dedicated training explained everything they had just witnessed. This wasn't military combatives or weekend hobby training. This was a lifetime of dedication to perfecting an art. 24 years, Thompson repeated. "You've been training longer than some of my Marines have been alive." Morrison nodded. "My father introduced me to it when I was a kid. He thought it would help with discipline and focus. I never imagined it would become such a central part of my life." Corporal Martinez, who had been quiet throughout the demonstration, spoke up. "So all that stuff Williams threw at you, you've seen it before?" "In various forms, yes," Morrison replied. "One of the advantages of long-term martial arts training is pattern recognition. After you've sparred with thousands of different people over the years, you start to see the common approaches and tendencies. Everyone has their preferred combinations and setups." Rodriguez stepped closer. "That throw you used on Williams, I've never seen anything like that in our training. It's called an Irimi Nage, though different styles have different names for it," Morrison explained. "The principle is to blend with your opponent's energy and redirect it rather than meeting force with force. Williams was committed to his takedown, so I simply gave his momentum a different direction." "You made it look effortless," Williams admitted. "I felt like I was fighting air." Morrison's expression grew more serious. "That's one of the goals of advanced karate training, to be effective while using minimal effort. It's not about being stronger or faster than your opponent. It's about understanding timing, distance, and leverage so well that you can neutralize threats without having to overpower them." Thompson found himself fascinated by this perspective. Military training emphasized aggression, overwhelming force, and decisive action. Morrison's approach seemed almost philosophical by comparison, yet the results spoke for themselves. "Can you show us more?" Rodriguez asked. "I mean, if you're comfortable demonstrating some techniques." Morrison glanced around the circle of expectant faces. These Marines had shown him respect and genuine curiosity rather than the ego-driven challenges he sometimes encountered from other military personnel. He could sense their authentic desire to learn. "I'd be happy to share what I can," Morrison said. "But I should mention that what I'm going to show you represents decades of training. Don't expect to master these concepts in an afternoon." "Understood," Thompson replied. "We're here to learn." Morrison gestured to Davis. "Would you mind helping me demonstrate something?" Davis stepped forward eagerly. He was roughly the same size as Morrison, making him a good choice for demonstration purposes. "Throw a straight punch in my chest," Morrison instructed. "Don't hold back. I want the Marines to see how this works against real force." Davis set himself and threw a solid straight punch with the full weight of his body behind it. Morrison's response was subtle but devastating. Instead of blocking or avoiding the punch, he stepped slightly offline while his hands moved in what looked like a simple circular motion. Davis found his punch redirected harmlessly past Morrison's body while his own balance became completely compromised. Morrison's follow-up was controlled but decisive, a palm strike that stopped just short of Davis's solar plexus. If this were a real fight, that would have ended it, Morrison explained as he helped Davis regain his footing. The key is not to fight against the attack, but to use its own energy. Davis put a lot of power into that punch, so I just gave it somewhere else to go. The Marines watched in fascination as Morrison broke down the movement in slow motion. What had appeared to be a single fluid motion was actually a complex sequence of precise timing and positioning. The footwork is crucial, Morrison continued, demonstrating the stepping pattern. Most people focus on the hand techniques, but in karate, everything starts with proper positioning. If your feet are in the wrong place, nothing else matters. Rodriguez tried to follow along, mimicking Morrison's stance and movement. Even at slow speed, he could feel how the positioning created leverage and options that weren't available from standard fighting stance. This is completely different from our training, Martinez observed. We're taught to move forward and overwhelm. Both approaches have their place, Morrison replied diplomatically. Military combat training needs to be simple and effective under extreme stress. What I'm showing you is more complex, but can be devastatingly effective once mastered. Williams, still nursing his bruised ego, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How good are you, really? I mean, in the bigger picture of karate. Morrison paused, considering how to answer without sounding boastful. I hold a 6th Dan black belt in Shotokan and 4th Dan ranks in 2 other styles. I've competed nationally and internationally, though competition is quite different from practical application. The Marines exchanged glances. Most of them knew enough about martial arts to understand that those rankings represented extraordinary levels of skill and dedication. A 6th-degree black belt was the kind of achievement that took decades to earn and represented mastery at the highest levels. Have you ever had to use it for real? Davis asked. Morrison's expression became more guarded. I've been fortunate that most situations can be de-escalated without violence. But, yes, there have been times when training proved useful. Thompson sensed there were stories behind that carefully neutral response, but he respected Morrison's discretion. Special operations personnel learned to be selective about what they shared. Would you be willing to show us more techniques? Rodriguez asked. Maybe something we could actually incorporate into our training? Morrison looked around the group thoughtfully. These Marines were approaching this with the right attitude, respectful curiosity rather than the need to prove themselves. That made him more willing to share genuine knowledge. There's one principle that might be useful for your training, Morrison said. In karate, we call it zanshin, awareness or continuation of attention. It's about maintaining complete focus and readiness even after a technique is completed. He gestured to Williams. When you threw your combinations earlier, you committed fully to each attack. That's good for power and aggression, but it also creates windows where you're vulnerable to counters. Morrison had Williams throw another combination, this time pointing out the moments where Williams was overextended or off balance. In karate, we train to maintain awareness and balance throughout any technique, so we're always ready for what comes next. The concept seemed simple, but as the Marines tried to apply in practice, they discovered how difficult it was to maintain that level of consciousness during physical confrontation. This is harder than it looks, Davis admitted after attempting to throw punches while maintaining the awareness Morrison described. It takes time, Morrison agreed. Most karate students spend years just learning to maintain proper form while moving. The combat applications come much later. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison continued sharing fundamental principles from his decades of training. He showed them how distance management could neutralize size and strength advantages, how timing could turn an opponent's aggression into a weakness, and how proper breathing could maintain energy and focus during extended confrontations. Each demonstration revealed layers of sophistication that the Marines had never encountered in their military training. These weren't just techniques. They were expressions of a complete fighting philosophy developed over centuries of refinement. I'm starting to understand why you were so calm when Williams challenged you, Rodriguez said during a break. You could see exactly how that match was going to play out, couldn't you? Morrison shrugged modestly. Experience teaches you to recognize patterns. Williams is a good fighter with solid fundamentals, but his approach was predictable if you knew what to look for. As the sun began to sink lower in the desert sky, the Marines found themselves looking at their visitor with entirely different eyes. The unassuming Navy SEAL who had arrived that morning had revealed himself to be a martial arts master whose knowledge went far beyond anything they had imagined possible. But Morrison's demonstrations had only scratched the surface of what 24 years of dedicated training could produce. The Marines were about to discover that their visitor had much more to teach them about the art of fighting and the philosophy behind it. Word of Morrison's demonstration spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire. By the next morning, twice as many Marines had gathered around the training area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Navy SEAL who had made their best fighter look like a beginner. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson found himself fielding requests from other units wanting to observe or participate in what had quickly become known as the karate lesson. He had never seen his Marines so eager to learn from an outsider, but Morrison's humble approach and obvious expertise had earned their respect in a way that rank or reputation never could. Morrison arrived at the training area to find nearly 40 Marines waiting for him, including several senior non-commissioned officers who had heard about the previous day's demonstrations. The attention made him slightly uncomfortable, but he recognized the genuine desire to learn in their faces. "Looks like word got out," Thompson said with a grin. "Hope you don't mind a bigger audience." "Not at all," Morrison replied, though he privately wondered how much meaningful instruction he could provide to such a large group. "What would you like to focus on today?" Staff Sergeant Rivera, a martial arts instructor-trainer from another company, stepped forward. "We've heard you've got some techniques that might complement our MCMAP training. Mind if we work together on some scenarios?" Morrison nodded, appreciating Rivera's professional approach. MCMAP, the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, was a comprehensive system that integrated techniques from various fighting disciplines. He was curious to see how his karate background might interface with their training. "Let's start with a common scenario," Rivera suggested. "Armed opponent with a knife. Standard MCMAP response is to control the weapon arm and neutralize with striking or joint manipulation." Rivera had one of his Marines, Corporal Peterson, hold a rubber training knife. Following MCMAP protocol, Rivera demonstrated the standard defense, grabbing the weapon arm with both hands, striking to vulnerable points, then applying an arm bar to disarm the attacker. It was effective and practical, the kind of technique that could save lives in real combat situations. Morrison watched carefully, noting the emphasis on aggression and overwhelming force that characterized military training. "So the technique Morrison acknowledged. Mind if I show an alternative approach?" Rivera gestured for him to proceed. Morrison asked Peterson to attack with the same knife thrust. Instead of meeting the attack with grabbing and striking, Morrison stepped offline at the last possible moment, his hands moving in a subtle spiral pattern that guided the knife past his body. In the same motion, he applied what appeared to be a gentle touch to Peterson's shoulder. The Marine found himself completely off balance, stumbling forward as Morrison stepped behind him, the knife now pointing harmlessly away from both fighters. "The principle is similar," Morrison explained, "but the execution focuses on redirecting rather than stopping the attack. Peterson's momentum and commitment work against him rather than forcing me to overpower him." Rivera studied the movement intently. "Show it again, slower." Morrison repeated the technique in slow motion, breaking down each component. What looked like a simple sidestep was actually a precise angular movement that took him offline while maintaining perfect distance. The hand contact that had disrupted Peterson's balance was applied at exactly the right moment with exactly the right pressure to exploit his forward momentum. "This is incredibly sophisticated," Rivera admitted. "How long does it take to learn something like this?" "Years," Morrison answered honestly. "This particular technique took me about 3 years to perform reliably, and I'm still finding new aspects of it after all this time." The honesty was refreshing. Many martial arts instructors promised rapid results, but Morrison's acknowledgement of the time and dedication required gave his instruction more credibility, not less. Sergeant Major Collins, the senior enlisted advisor for the base training command, had arrived during the demonstration. A veteran with over 20 years of service, he had seen every type of combat training the military offered. Petty Officer Morrison, Collins said, approaching the group. I understand you've been sharing some advanced techniques with our Marines. Yes, Sergeant Major, Morrison replied. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson invited me to participate in their training. Collins nodded approvingly. I've been hearing good things. Mind if I see what all the fuss is about? The crowd of Marines parted respectfully as Collins stepped forward. At 52 years old, he wasn't as fast as the younger fighters, but his experience and tactical understanding were legendary among the enlisted ranks. Pick your scenario, Collins said to Morrison. Morrison considered carefully. Collins deserved respect, but the Sergeant Major had also issued what amounted to a formal challenge in front of 40 Marines. Morrison needed to demonstrate his abilities without embarrassing a senior leader. How about we work on multiple attackers? Morrison suggested. It's a common concern in real-world situations, and the techniques might be applicable to your training. Collins grinned. Fair enough. Rivera, Peterson, you're with me. Standard scenario, 3-on-1 confrontation, no weapons. The 3 Marines spread out around Morrison, positioning themselves at different angles to prevent easy escape. It was a tactical setup that would challenge any fighter, regardless of skill level. Morrison stood in the center, his posture relaxed but alert. To the watching Marines, he appeared almost casual, as if facing 3 experienced fighters was an everyday occurrence. Collins nodded to his partners, and all 3 Marines moved simultaneously. It was a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm any single defender through superior numbers and positioning. What happened next defied everything the Marines understood about fighting. Morrison didn't retreat or try to escape the encirclement. Instead, he moved toward Collins, the most dangerous of the 3 attackers, but at an angle that put the Sergeant Major between Morrison and the other 2 Marines. Collins threw a solid combination, but Morrison's response was to blend with the attack rather than oppose it. His hands found Collins' lead arm, and suddenly, the Sergeant Major was off balance, inadvertently blocking Peterson's approach. Before Rivera could adjust his position, Morrison had used Collins' momentum to pivot behind him, placing the Sergeant Major directly in the path of Rivera's attack. The 3 Marines found themselves interfering with each other while Morrison moved through their formation like water flowing around stones. Within seconds, Morrison had positioned himself outside the triangle, leaving the 3 Marines temporarily tangled and unable to coordinate their next move. He could have struck any of them during the sequence, but instead he simply stepped back and waited for them to reorganize. The watching Marines erupted in amazed murmurs. They had just witnessed someone turn a 3-on-1 disadvantage into a position of tactical superiority using nothing but movement and timing. Collins straightened his uniform and shook his head in amazement. That was outstanding. How did you move between us so easily? Morrison's respect for Collins was evident in his response. In karate, we spent a lot of time studying spatial relationships and timing. When multiple opponents attack, they create openings and limitations for each other. The key is to move in ways that exploit those natural conflicts. Show us again. Rivera requested. I want to see exactly how you used our positioning against us. Morrison repeated the sequence, this time explaining his decision-making process. He pointed out how Collins' attack created a natural screen that blocked Peterson's approach, how Rivera's angle of attack created a corridor of movement, and how moving toward the most dangerous opponent often created the safest position. This is chess, not checkers, Peterson observed. You're thinking several moves ahead. Exactly, Morrison confirmed. One of the most important aspects of advanced martial arts training is developing tactical thinking. You learn to see the fight as a dynamic system rather than a series of individual exchanges. Sergeant Major Collins found himself deeply impressed by both Morrison's skill and his teaching ability. The SEAL was sharing genuine expertise without arrogance or condescension, treating the Marines as peers worthy of his knowledge. What other principles might be applicable to our training? Collins asked. Morrison considered the question carefully. Distance management is crucial. Most fighters think in terms of in-range or out of range, but there are actually multiple zones of engagement, each with different advantages and risks. He had Rivera and Peterson face off, then walked around them, pointing out the various distances and what techniques were available from each position. At this range, Morrison said, positioning them about 8 feet apart. You're safe from most attacks, but also can't effectively counter. Move closer, he guided Rivera forward, and now you're in kicking range. Closer still, and punches become viable. Closer than that, and you're in grappling range where different rules apply. The Marines began to understand that fighting wasn't just about techniques. It was about controlling the space and distance between opponents. Morrison's demonstrations showed how master-level fighters could dictate engagement ranges to maximize their advantages while minimizing threats. In my experience, Morrison continued, most altercations happen because people don't understand these ranges. They either stay too far away to be effective, or they close to a distance where they're vulnerable to techniques they haven't trained for. Williams, who had been watching quietly since his humbling experience the day before, raised his hand. How do you train to get comfortable at all these different ranges? Sparring. Morrison answered simply. Lots and lots of sparring with many different types of people. Every opponent teaches you something different about timing, distance, and tactics. He gestured to the assembled Marines. You have an advantage here. You've all trained with each other extensively, so you understand each other's tendencies and preferences. But that can also be a limitation if you only spar with the same people. Thompson nodded in understanding. That's why we bring in instructors from other disciplines occasionally. Fresh perspectives keep us sharp. Exactly, Morrison agreed. In karate, we have a saying, the dojo is not the whole world. Your training partners can only teach you what they know. To grow, you need exposure to different approaches and philosophies. As the afternoon session continued, Morrison shared increasingly sophisticated concepts from his decades of training. He demonstrated how breath control could maintain energy during extended confrontations, how subtle shifts in posture could telegraph or hide intentions, and how mental attitude could influence the outcome of physical confrontations. Each lesson revealed new layers of depth to what the Marines had initially dismissed as just another fighting style. Morrison's karate wasn't about breaking boards or performing elaborate forms. It was a comprehensive system for understanding and controlling violent encounters. But the Marines were about to discover that Morrison's knowledge extended far beyond physical techniques. The mental and philosophical aspects of his training were about to challenge their understanding of what it truly meant to be a warrior. By the third day of Morrison's impromptu training sessions, the atmosphere at Camp Pendleton had shifted dramatically. Marines from multiple units were requesting permission to attend what had evolved into comprehensive seminars on advanced fighting theory. Morrison found himself addressing groups that included not just enlisted personnel, but officers and senior staff who had heard about his unique approach to combat training. Colonel Sarah Henderson, the base training director, had decided to observe the sessions personally. A former military police officer with extensive experience in close-quarters combat, she was skeptical of any training that wasn't immediately applicable to battlefield conditions. But reports from her senior NCOs suggested that Morrison was sharing knowledge that could genuinely enhance their combat effectiveness. Morrison stood before a group of 60 Marines, feeling the weight of their expectations. Word had spread that he was more than just skilled. He was a legitimate master of his art with knowledge that went beyond anything available in conventional military training. Today, I'd like to talk about something that often gets overlooked in combat training, Morrison began. The mental aspects of fighting. Physical techniques are only part of the equation. Sergeant Major Collins, who had become an enthusiastic supporter of these sessions, nodded encouragingly. His own experience had taught him that mental preparation often determined the outcome of confrontations more than pure physical ability. In karate, we spend considerable time developing what we call mushin, a state of no mind or mental emptiness, Morrison continued. It sounds mystical, but it's actually very practical. When your mind is clear of fear, anger, or preconceived notions, you can respond to threats with complete spontaneity. Corporal Davis raised his hand. How does that apply to real combat situations? In Afghanistan, I was pretty much always afraid or angry or both. Morrison's expression showed understanding rather than judgment. Fear and anger are natural responses to danger, and they can be useful if channeled correctly. The problem comes when they control you instead of you controlling them. He gestured to Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant, would you mind helping me demonstrate something? Rodriguez stepped forward curious about where this was heading. Morrison's previous demonstrations had been enlightening, but this sounded more theoretical. "I want you to attack me with everything you've got," Morrison said. "But first, I want you to think about something that makes you angry. Really angry. Focus on that feeling while you fight." Rodriguez considered for a moment. Then his expression hardened as he called up memories from his deployment. A roadside bomb that had killed 2 of his friends. The helplessness he had felt watching good Marines die for no reason. When Rodriguez attacked, his strikes carried real fury behind them. He threw combinations with bad intentions, the kind of violence that could seriously injure an unprepared opponent. Morrison's response was measured and precise. He didn't try to match Rodriguez's aggression. Instead, he moved with calm efficiency, redirecting the angry attacks and controlling the distance between them. Rodriguez found himself becoming more frustrated as none of his strikes landed, his anger making him increasingly reckless and predictable. After 30 seconds, Morrison simply stepped back, and Rodriguez stood breathing heavily, his energy depleted by his emotional intensity. "Now," Morrison said quietly, "try it again. But this time let go of the anger. Don't think about anything except what's happening right here, right now." Rodriguez took a deep breath, consciously releasing the memories that had fueled his previous attack. When he engaged Morrison again, his movements were more controlled, more thoughtful. He was still aggressive, but it was calculated aggression rather than emotional fury. The difference was immediately apparent to the watching Marines. Rodriguez's second attack was more dangerous precisely because it was less emotional. His techniques were cleaner, his timing better, and his energy was conserved rather than wasted on empty rage. "That's the difference between fighting angry and fighting clear," Morrison explained as the 2 men reset. "Anger can give you initial intensity, but it also makes you predictable and burns through your energy quickly. Clarity allows you to maintain effectiveness over extended periods." Colonel Henderson found herself impressed despite her initial skepticism. She had seen too many young Marines become casualties because they let emotions drive their tactical decisions. Morrison's demonstration illustrated principles that could genuinely save lives. "How do you develop that kind of mental control?" she asked. Morrison turned toward the colonel with respectful attention. "Years of practice, ma'am. In traditional karate training, we spend as much time on meditation and mental discipline as we do on physical techniques. The goal is to develop unshakable calm under pressure." Meditation. Corporal Williams looked skeptical. "That seems pretty far removed from combat training." Morrison smiled at the reaction he had expected. "I understand the reluctance. When I was younger, I thought meditation was just sitting around doing nothing. But it's actually training for your mind, just like physical exercise trains your body." He gestured to the assembled group. "How many of you have experienced tunnel vision during high-stress situations? Lost peripheral awareness when things got intense?" Nearly every hand in the group went up. It was a common phenomenon among combat veterans, the tendency for perception to narrow under extreme stress, sometimes with dangerous consequences. "Meditation trains you to maintain broad awareness even under pressure," Morrison explained. "It teaches you to observe your own mental state objectively, so you can recognize when fear or anger are affecting your judgment." Staff Sergeant Rivera, who had become increasingly interested in Morrison's teaching methods, spoke up. "Can you show us what that looks like in practice?" Morrison nodded. "I'll need several volunteers for this one." 5 Marines stepped forward, including Williams, Peterson, Rodriguez, and Davis. Morrison had them spread out around him in a loose circle about 10 feet away. "I want each of you to attack me at different times," Morrison instructed. "Don't coordinate, just attack when you feel the opportunity. My goal is to maintain awareness of all 5 of you simultaneously while dealing with each attack as it comes." To the watching Marines, it seemed like an impossible task. Maintaining situational awareness while actively engaged in combat was one of the most challenging aspects of real-world fighting. Williams made the first move, stepping in with a combination of punches. Morrison dealt with the attack efficiently, redirecting and controlling without losing track of the other 4 Marines. Even as he was physically engaged with Williams, his peripheral vision and spatial awareness allowed him to track the movements of the others. Peterson attacked next, followed quickly by Rodriguez. Morrison flowed between the confrontations like a dancer moving between partners, never becoming so focused on one opponent that he lost awareness of the others. What amazed the watching Marines was Morrison's apparent calmness throughout the exercise. Even with 5 skilled fighters attacking him unpredictably, he never appeared rushed or overwhelmed. His breathing remained steady, his movements economical, and his awareness complete. After several minutes, Morrison called a halt to the exercise. The 5 attacking Marines were breathing hard and showing signs of fatigue, while Morrison appeared as fresh as when he had started. "That's what 20 years of mental training looks like," Sergeant Major Collins observed to Colonel Henderson. "He's not just physically superior. He's operating from a completely different mental state." Henderson nodded, finally, understanding why her senior NCOs have been so enthusiastic about Morrison's instruction. This wasn't just exotic martial arts technique. It was advanced warrior psychology that could directly enhance combat effectiveness. "Petty Officer Morrison," she said, approaching him after the demonstration, "I'm wondering if you might be willing to extend your stay here for a few more days. What you're teaching could benefit our entire training program." Morrison glanced around at the expectant faces of the Marines who had been learning from him. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and he recognized the rare opportunity to share knowledge that might genuinely help these warriors survive dangerous situations. "I'd be honored, ma'am," he replied. "Though I should mention that what I've shown you so far is just the beginning. The deeper principles take considerable time to internalize." "How deep does this go?" Rodriguez asked, his curiosity evident. Morrison's smile carried hints of knowledge vast and profound. "In karate, we say that training never ends. I've been studying for 24 years, and I still consider myself a student. Every day brings new understanding." Colonel Henderson found herself intrigued by the philosophical implications of Morrison's approach. Military training emphasized measurable skills and quantifiable outcomes, but Morrison was describing a path of continuous growth that seemed to have no endpoint. "What's the ultimate goal?" she asked. "Where does all this training lead?" Morrison paused, considering how to explain concepts that had taken him decades to begin to understand. In the highest levels of karate, the goal isn't to become a better fighter, it's to become a better person. The physical techniques are just tools for developing character, discipline, and wisdom. The Marines exchanged glances. This was territory most of them had never considered. They were accustomed to thinking of combat training in terms of tactical advantage and battlefield effectiveness, not personal development and philosophical growth. "I know it sounds abstract," Morrison continued, "but there's practical value in this approach. When you train with the goal of improving yourself rather than just defeating others, you develop different qualities: patience, humility, genuine confidence rather than false bravado." Williams, who had been quiet since his earlier sparring session with Morrison, found the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him. "Do you think we've been approaching this wrong? Our training, I mean." Morrison's response was careful and respectful. "Your training is designed for specific purposes, and it's very effective for those purposes. What I'm sharing is complementary, not contradictory. Think of it as additional tools in your toolkit." As the afternoon session concluded, the Marines found themselves grappling with ideas that challenged their fundamental assumptions about fighting, training, and the warrior mindset. Morrison had opened a door to concepts that extended far beyond physical combat techniques. But they were about to discover that Morrison's deepest insights weren't about fighting at all. They were about the philosophy of strength, the responsibility that came with dangerous knowledge, and what it truly meant to be a protector rather than just a warrior. On Morrison's final day at Camp Pendleton, nearly 100 Marines had gathered for what everyone understood would be his concluding session. Word had spread throughout the base that the quiet Navy SEAL was preparing to share the deepest insights from his decades of martial arts training. Colonel Henderson had granted special permission for the extended session, recognizing that Morrison was offering knowledge that went far beyond standard military curriculum. Even officers from other branches had requested permission to observe, creating an unprecedented gathering of military personnel united by curiosity about the warrior arts. Morrison stood before the assembled group, feeling the weight of their expectation and trust. Over the past week, these Marines had shown him respect, humility, and genuine desire to learn. They deserved his most honest insights about what he had discovered during his lifelong journey in the martial arts. Today, I want to talk about something that may seem contradictory. Morrison began. The ultimate goal of learning to fight is to avoid fighting whenever possible. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't what they had expected to hear from someone who had demonstrated such devastating combat skills. Sergeant Major Collins leaned forward with interest. His years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous people were often the most reluctant to use their abilities. When I was younger, Morrison continued, I trained primarily to become more effective in combat. I wanted to be able to defeat any opponent to prove that my style and my skills were superior. He paused, his expression reflecting years of hard-earned wisdom. But as my understanding deepened, I began to realize that true mastery isn't about winning fights. It's about not needing to fight at all. Williams raised his hand tentatively. But what about when you don't have a choice? When someone else forces the confrontation? Morrison nodded appreciatively at the question. That's exactly the right question, Corporal. And the answer is complex. He gestured to Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant, what's the primary purpose of your military training? Rodriguez considered carefully. To protect our country and our fellow Marines, Petty Officer. Exactly, Morrison confirmed. You're protectors, not aggressors. The same principle applies to advanced martial arts training. The goal is to develop the ability to protect yourself, your loved ones, innocent people who can't protect themselves. He began walking slowly among the seated Marines as he spoke, making eye contact with individuals throughout the group. In my tradition, there's a concept called Bushido, the way of the warrior. It's often misunderstood as glorifying combat, but the true meaning is about accepting responsibility for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Colonel Henderson found herself nodding as Morrison spoke. This philosophy aligned perfectly with the military's core values, but approached from a completely different direction. The paradox, Morrison continued, is that the more capable you become of inflicting harm, the greater your responsibility becomes to avoid causing unnecessary harm. Davis spoke up from the back of the group. How do you know when force is necessary versus when it isn't? Morrison smiled at another excellent question. That's one of the most important things advanced training teaches you. The ability to accurately assess threats and respond with exactly the appropriate level of force. He gestured to the training mat. Rivera, would you mind helping me demonstrate something? Staff Sergeant Rivera stepped forward eagerly. Over the past week, he had become one of Morrison's most dedicated students, fascinated by the depth of knowledge behind the physical techniques. I want you to approach me aggressively, Morrison instructed, but I'm going to show you several different response options, each appropriate for different levels of threat. Rivera took an aggressive posture and stepped toward Morrison. Morrison's first response was simply to move, a slight shift in position that created space and broke Rivera's momentum without any physical contact. De-escalation through positioning, Morrison explained. Often, simply refusing to be where the aggressor expects you to be can defuse a situation. Rivera approached again, this time more persistently. Morrison's response was to establish light contact, a gentle but firm hand on Rivera's chest that stopped his forward movement while communicating calm authority rather than aggression. Minimal contact to establish boundaries, Morrison narrated. This sends a clear message without escalation. For the third demonstration, Morrison asked Rivera to simulate a genuine attack. This time, Morrison's response was decisive and immediate, the kind of technique he had demonstrated earlier in the week that left Rivera completely controlled and neutralized. Overwhelming response when genuine threat is present, Morrison concluded as he helped Rivera regain his footing. The key is matching your response to the actual level of threat, not to your emotional state or ego. The Marines were beginning to understand that Morrison's training had given him something more valuable than just fighting ability. It had developed his judgment about when and how to use that ability. This is what takes decades to master, Morrison explained. Not just the physical techniques, but the wisdom to apply them appropriately. Young martial artists often want to use their skills to prove themselves. Mature martial artists rarely need to use their skills at all. Corporal Peterson raised his hand. But doesn't that mean all the training is kind of pointless if you're trying not to fight? Morrison's laugh was warm and understanding. I used to wonder the same thing. But Here's what I've learned. The confidence that comes from knowing you can handle almost any physical confrontation actually makes you calmer and more controlled in tense situations. He gestured broadly to encompass the entire group. How many of you have noticed that the Marines you respect most, the real hard chargers, tend to be the calmest under pressure? Nearly every hand in the group went up. It was a phenomenon they all recognized, but had never really analyzed. It's the same principle, Morrison explained. When you know you have the tools to handle a situation, you don't need to posture or escalate. You can afford to be patient, to look for peaceful solutions, because you're not afraid of what might happen if those solutions fail. Sergeant Major Collins found this insight particularly compelling. In his experience, the Marines who were quickest to anger or most eager to fight were usually the ones with the least actual combat experience. So the real purpose of all this training, Collins said slowly, is to give you options? Exactly, Morrison confirmed. The untrained person has only a few choices when confronted with aggression: submit, flee, or escalate. Advanced training gives you dozens of options between those extremes. Williams, who had been quiet for most of the session, suddenly understood something that had been bothering him all week. That's why you were so calm when I challenged you that first day. You could see options I couldn't even imagine. Morrison nodded respectfully. You fought exactly as you've been trained to fight, Williams. There's nothing wrong with that approach. It's effective and battle-tested. But my training had given me additional tools that you hadn't been exposed to. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Michael Thompson, the base commander, who had come to personally thank Morrison for his contributions to their training program. Petty Officer Morrison, the general said, approaching with his aide. I understand you've been sharing some remarkable insights with our Marines. Morrison came to attention automatically, but General Thompson gestured for him to remain at ease. Yes, sir, Morrison replied. The Marines have been exceptional students, very receptive to new ideas. General Thompson looked around at the assembled group. For what I hear, you've given them a lot more than new fighting techniques. You've given them a new way of thinking about the warrior profession. The general's words carried weight with every Marine present. Coming from their commanding officer, this wasn't just casual praise. It was official recognition of the value Morrison had brought to their training. What I'd like to know, General Thompson continued, is whether you might consider making this arrangement more permanent. We could use someone with your knowledge and teaching ability on our permanent staff. Morrison was genuinely surprised by the offer. He had come to Camp Pendleton for what he thought would be a brief observation, and now he was being offered the opportunity to fundamentally change how Marines approach combat training. That's a generous offer, General, Morrison replied. But I think my value here is as a visitor sharing a different perspective, not as a permanent instructor trying to replace your existing programs. General Thompson nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps you're right, but would you consider returning periodically? Maybe quarterly seminars for our advanced students? Morrison looked around at the faces of the Marines who had become not just students, but genuine partners in exploring the deeper aspects of warrior training. I would be honored, sir, Morrison replied. As the formal session concluded and the Marines began to disperse, many of them approached Morrison individually to thank him and ask final questions. The transformation in their attitudes was remarkable. The skeptical challengers who had first met him had become thoughtful students eager to continue learning. Rodriguez was among the last to leave. Petty Officer Morrison, he said, extending his hand, you've changed how I think about everything we do here. Thank you. Morrison shook his hand warmly. You changed my thinking too, Rodriguez. Teaching forces you to examine your own understanding more deeply. I learned as much from all of you as you learned from me. As Morrison packed his gear and prepared to return to his own unit, he reflected on the unexpected week he had just experienced. He had come to Camp Pendleton as an observer, but had discovered the deep satisfaction that came from sharing knowledge with people who genuinely wanted to learn. The Marines, meanwhile, found themselves with a completely new perspective on their profession. Morrison had shown them that fighting was just one tool in a much larger toolkit, that true strength came from wisdom rather than just physical ability, and that the highest goal of warrior training was not to defeat others, but to protect and serve something greater than themselves. Colonel Henderson stood watching Morrison's departure with a mixture of gratitude and regret. In just 1 week, The quiet Navy SEAL had challenged every assumption her Marines held about fighting, training, and the nature of true strength. But Morrison's greatest gift to the Marines hadn't been his technical knowledge or even his philosophical insights. He had shown them that mastery was a lifelong journey, that there was always more to learn, and that the most dangerous warriors were often the most humble and thoughtful people. As Morrison's vehicle disappeared in the distance, the Marines were already beginning to implement the lessons they had learned. They would never again assume that the quiet, unassuming person was necessarily the less dangerous one. They had discovered that true mastery often wore the face of humility, and that the most profound strength was the kind that never needed to prove itself to anyone. The story of the Navy SEAL who humbled an entire Marine unit would become legend at Camp Pendleton, but more importantly, the principles Morrison had shared would continue to influence how those Marines approached their profession for the rest of their careers. They had learned that fighting was an art, that strength was a responsibility, and that the true warrior's path led not toward violence, but toward wisdom.